Hello.
Yeah. It looked like an audience of one.
It's good eye contact. How do you feel about Chicago's lost neighborhoods? Did I get your punch card? Okay. So you remember for next time, though, and I'll remember fun fact. Yes, perfect. Did I get yours? Gentlemen, are we ready? Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Hello, hello. Great to see so many friendly faces today. Folks in the back, don't fear. We will be doing a long intro today to make sure you get through the bar line, get your bevies. Giovina. Sorry to call you out, friend. All right, folks, so welcome, welcome. We are Chicago for Chicagoans. We're a 501c nonprofit with the mission of sharing that all is great and good and gritty and interesting and lost about Chicago. Generally for Chicagoans, but tourists are welcome when they find us. So if you are so inspired tonight, feel free to donate. We are a volunteer-run organization, and your donations help us pay our fabulous, wonderful presenters who spend months of their life researching all these obscure and unknown parts of Chicago history, and helps us keep our programming going. So if you are so inspired, there are QR codes placed towards the back of the room. We also accept cash, kidneys, and cash. No firstborn children. It got a little too hot topic-y. Sorry. So tonight, folks, is the last night of our 2023 winter lecture series with the theme Gone But Not Forgotten. And it's been wonderful seeing you all out here this year. It's been great to be back in person. But we're going to keep the fun rolling because next week we have a party. We're having our end of season party, so be sure to get on Eventbrite right now and get your tickets because there's like literally 3 left. So you can come out here to room 13, have your favorite bevies with your favorite lecturers and volunteers, and just have a grand old time. Friends watching the live stream at home, the party will not be live streamed for obvious reasons. So be sure to come join us in person. So, keeping the fun rolling, keep an eye on our socials and your inbox for a newsletter. We are going to be starting our summer tour series. This is how our organization first got started. We gave walking tours of the neighborhoods led by the locals. So, we're going to be doing that again. Tours start at the end of May. Dates for the neighborhoods will be announced in the coming weeks. Don't have exact date when, but soon. But I do have an exact date. Mark your calendars for April 22nd. If you have been to our events and you are so inspired to get up here behind the mic and also, share your love of Chicago history with your friends, families, and strangers, we have a program for you. It's called Tour Guide 101. Yours truly is a graduate. As Patty says, come to enough of these events and she will force you to, encourage you, wrangle you to join their ranks as a guide. So Tour Guide 101 teaches you everything you would need to know to be a neighborhood guide and a lecturer. So that is on April 22nd. Registration will be posted shortly. Please keep an eye on our socials, Instagram and Facebook, for that to be announced. And another thing with summer coming around, we need volunteers. So if you want to join us on our walking tours to help support the neighborhood guides, very importantly, help us work our beer tent. Memorial Day weekend, we are right here in front of Trader Todd's working their beer tent for the Belmont Sheffield Fest. So you get into the festival, you meet some great people, and it's by far our largest fundraiser every year. And there every year, it's a great time, very fun. We raised over $4,000 last summer, so that's a lot for our small but mighty organization. So if you are interested in volunteering, please email info@chicagoforchicagoans.org Or slide into our DMs on Instagram, because that's where I'll find it. Let's see. We are also looking for another volunteer for a very special position. This would be our merch manager. If you are so inspired to help us lead the charge with all our merch dreams and desires, check out our Facebook. There's more information there. I am also a volunteer, as is our wonderful speaker tonight, Anthony Alfaro. So if you are interested in that position and want to know what it's like to be a positioned volunteer, yeah, that works. Talk to us. So without further ado, the man, the myth, the legend, Anthony Alfaro, Northside native, guide to many neighborhoods, Westridge, Rogers Park, and Buena Park, just being a few among the many. He is here to regale us with the wonderful tales of the lost neighborhoods of Chicago. Let's give it up for Anthony. Go get him, Tiger.
Man, there's a lot of you tonight. I wasn't expecting such a big crowd. So this year's topic, we decided to do lost things in Chicago. Things you can't see anymore. Things that either got knocked down through eminent domain, urban renewal, or they just decayed to death. So this wasn't really a fun topic. Last year I got to talk about chickens playing instruments and midgets and knife throwers and flame swallowers when I did the dime museums. So this I'm like, this is kind of somber. So like even in my notes when I was making the slideshow, I'm like, I didn't feel being too cheeky this time because I'm like, and usually I am very tongue-in-cheek. If you know me personally or on social media, I am very tongue-in-cheek. But when we're talking about neighborhoods, these are people's homes and churches and synagogues. And I remember when I was an undergrad, when I was an anthropology major, my professor would always say, I romanticize the past too much. I like to think I humanize it because we can think of a store, it's just a store, but like a home. These were where people had celebrations and wedding receptions and Christmas and Thanksgiving. And these were lost in these couple of neighborhoods that I'm going to talk to about tonight. My original lecture was going to be a lot longer, but I'm like, I refuse to keep these people longer than an hour and a half. I'm like, I've been to long lectures. I know that sweet point where you start losing people. So I'm like, I tried to keep it around 45, 55 minutes. And I'm like, how do you actually do this? Talk about lost neighborhoods. I'm like, they're scattered everywhere in the city. So I'm like, let's be logical. So we're going to start on the south side by the lake, loop around and end on the northwest side. And hopefully you're not too depressed by the time we're done with this presentation. So the first one we're going to talk about tonight, it's a pretty well-known one. If you like Chicago history or Chicago architecture, you may have heard of Logan Square. This was in the Douglas neighborhood in Chicago. If you don't know where Douglas is, don't worry. It's like this little pocket neighborhood along the lake between Cottage Grove and the 30s. It doesn't even really reach the 40s. It would become a very exclusive enclave when people did not want to live by Chicago anymore because it was sooty and gritty and full of immigrants, because this is how Victorians thought. So they came here to Douglas. But before it was known as Douglas, it was known as Cleaverville, which does not roll off the tongue, and it was not a nice place to live. Cleaverville was actually named after someone, his last name was Cleaver. We had a soap factory there, an early stockyard, saloons, and wooden shanties. This was not a pretty place to live. And to make it even more interesting, because it wasn't already depressing enough as it was, we had a Confederate prisoner of war camp, Camp Douglas. So you had all this weird, odd, sad things together. But why would rich people want to live there? Well, public transportation got better in the 1870s. So now you have streetcar lines and the CTA kind of starting to come down here. And this is lakefront property. So rich people who are tired of living closer to Loop around Prairie Avenue where it's dense, we want to move farther south. So the soap factory closed. The stockyard moved to the town of Lake, which is in back of the yards today, where the rest of the stockyard district was. The shanties got knocked down, and you got this very, very elegant, high-density, Victorian, upper-middle-class neighborhood. And these people Like when we talk about dense Victorian, think of like Lincoln Park, where like 5 or 6 story tall buildings, brick with elaborate cornices and all the turrets. This is what this neighborhood was like. And even shopping, they didn't even have to leave the neighborhood. Cottage Grove had a bunch of stores. They even had an early shopping arcade. If you don't know what a shopping arcade is, it's a precursor to the shopping mall. So you would go into this large building, and the top would be all glass, and you can go to like 20 or 30 shops, and they all radiate off this central area. This was like the height of Victorian shopping. Chicago has no more shopping arcades thanks to Loyola University. They knocked the last one down a couple years ago, the Woodruff Arcade. Thanks, Loyola. But as expensive as this neighborhood was, it was very dense. You did not have a yard. There was a park in the neighborhood that's still there today. It's Ellis Park. There's actually a Victorian poem about it. It's a pretty poem. But everyone who lived in Oakland would have been jealous of people who lived in Aldine Square. Aldine Square, it was around 37th and 38th Street, bounded by Vincennes and Eden Street. Eden Street, it also does not exist anymore today, so now it's a forgotten street. It was 42 row houses built in the European style, because this is 1872. Anything European, namely French, is in vogue. So you have limestone exteriors, wrought iron grills, staircases. The woodwork inside would be all walnut. And what made it so exceptional to live there, you had a semi-private park. It was built in the shape of a U, and everyone who lived in Aldine Square had access to the park, also to people who were their guests, and it also had a pond in the center. So for a very dense neighborhood, this was quite the luxury. And because people who lived there were pretty extra, you did not have a Vincennes address. You would tell people, I live at 42 Aldine Square or at 16 Aldine Square. So if you were shopping at Marshall Fields downtown and you wanted to impress somebody, like, ma'am, where are we sending the packages to? Oh, 17 Aldine Square. You would know this person has money. Because the elite were leaving the closer core to the city. It was getting gritty, dirty, all this industry's moving in. We had a lot of soot back then because everything was coal. So people wanted to come out here. This was a very tight-knit community. People in Aldine Square didn't even have to handle their own horses. There was a stable on site where you got to push the button. When you were ready to leave, they would tell the driver, the person in charge of the stables, hey, number 16 wants their horse. Okay, we'll clean it up and bring it out for them. There was a gardener on site because the ground did need to be maintained. And also, there's also a really tight-knit community because these people lived in this little bubble. Now, I'll talk to a little about later about this tightness that they carried on even after they left the neighborhood. The neighborhood started to peak in the 1880s. By the 1890s, there was ethnic change. And this is where people are thinking, oh, the Black Belt's expanding. No, because it was the Irish. Aldine Square was very waspy, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They did not like the Irish. The Irish that were moving into this neighborhood were very middle class. If you heard the term lace curtain Irish, these were Irish people that had money. But still, they weren't good enough to live in this neighborhood. The Irish were closer to the northern part of Douglas by IIT. There used to be a really impressive church called St. James that was knocked down a couple years ago. When the Irish built it, every single stained glass was Tiffany and Company. So they were affluent, but these people from New England who lived in Aldine Square, they remember in New England that who live in inner cities, the Irish, who are crowding the public school, the Irish. So they started to eventually leave. So this neighborhood started to change a little bit. It was still very middle class, but it wasn't as exclusive anymore. And then as more money started to come leave the area, this was about the 1890s, 1900s. People with money realized they don't have to live in terrace houses anymore or row houses. This is when you start seeing money starting to flock to Hyde Park and especially Kenwood, because you don't even need a semi-private park anymore because the grounds you own in Kenwood are basically your private park. If you ever go down Kenwood, recommend going down Greenwood Avenue. Those houses are huge. And this is what this changed. Like, you didn't have to live in this dense neighborhood anymore. Public transportation's coming down further south. Money's moving further south. The Irish are moving in. The Irish really didn't stay there very long because the Black Belt was expanding. When the Black Belt expanded into Alding Square, for a brief moment of time, this area was known as a very middle-class black section. They would always see Alding Square from the distance, but they could never live there. Now they could afford to live there. But it was short-lived as the Black Belt kept expanding. In the neighborhood, you had larger units of apartments that were 3 or 4 bedrooms getting chopped up into kitchenettes. So you started having an apartment that was maybe supposed to have 3 families, now has 12. And if somebody knows anything about plumbing, that wreaks havoc on plumbing, because a lot of times when they made kitchenettes, they would put a hot plate so you have a kitchen, and they would put a toilet, and that sounds like it'd be great, so everyone has their own bathroom. But no, it would cause frequent backups and sewage leaks. It was not a good time to live in this area. The black middle class left as the Black Belt kept expanding. They followed their white predecessors. They kept wanting better homes, better neighborhoods, better schools, even integrated neighborhoods. Eventually, by the 1930s, Alding Square was renamed DeSable Square. Not DuSable, but DeSable Square. And it was basically decaying. The once lovely grounds were weedy. The townhouses that were 42 doubled in size because they were subdivided. And even the lovely pond that people love to write about in postcards, if you can see old postcards of Alding Square, thank you, it grew stagnant. If you don't have a functioning fountain, this pond that's not getting constantly water renewed is going to grow duckweed and get that horrible smell in the summertime. By the 1930s, there's no way to save Alding Square. It was hit by the wrecking ball. So we did lose it, but people that were happy about its demise were the black people who had to live there. So as architecture, we look at like this is such a slaughter of architecture, but when they created the Ida B. Wells homes there in the 1930s, these were nice homes. Like back in the 30s, we made really good, decent public housing. Like it wasn't these skyscrapers we built in the 50s, it was townhouses. And you had all this land. And this was the first time many people in the Black Belt actually owned land where they can touch. This wasn't living in a crowded apartment. You could grow flowers outside your yard. And they had a community center on site. The wait list to get in here was immense because people knew this neighborhood was pretty crowded. The sewers are always backing up. But Ida B. Wells is this bright, new, clean, airy settlement we can live in. And this continued for a long time till the 1980s hit. And then this area became really gang problems. You had aging structures. They weren't maintained by the Chicago Housing Authority. And then by the 2000s, they have to come down. We didn't actually replace them with public housing, though it's mixed income housing called Oakwood Shores today. It's pretty nice architecture. It is nowhere near as nice as what Alding Square was. But it's this hope that they can create a better community by not concentrating poverty, by mixing incomes. So hopefully, the area where Alding Square was will rebloom again. Currently, it is an empty lot, but there's always hope. And I also did mention that Alding, in the past, they had a tight-knit community. Well, in the late 1920s, everyone who lived in Alding Square was invited to the LaSalle Hotel, which is a very glamorous hotel in the Loop, to have a reunion. And all these people came and they ate and they talked about this neighborhood that they loved so much. And it's pretty heartwarming. It's also very bittersweet because this lost neighborhood ended up having their reunion at the LaSalle Hotel, which is also a lost hotel because they hit the wrecking ball in the 1970s. So it is bittersweet. Chicago did lose a bit of its Eden. Alding Square was referred to as the Eden of Chicago. But hopefully there is progress being made in this neighborhood. And We lost something great, but hopefully something greater can come up from it. And sticking with the South Side, there's a lot on the South Side. We knocked a lot of the South Side down. We're horrible. We are going to Englewood. And many people know Englewood because Devil in the White City, but I'm not going to talk about that because you have to hear Adam Seltzer talk about that. He'll talk about it a lot. But Englewood has a very interesting history. As a lot of suburbs do with very industrial sounding names, it was originally Chicago Junction because of all the train tracks, but that didn't sound romantic enough or very middle class, so we named Englewood after Englewood, New Jersey. I don't know how romantic that is, but I guess I didn't want to be associated with trains. Englewood started off as a streetcar suburb. If you were affluent enough not to live in the back of the yards neighborhood, like a foreman or an executive at the meatpacking plants, you wanted to live here. You didn't smell the meatpacking because it's horrible smell. It also was the birthplace of Chicago Normal School. If you're aware of Chicago State University or my alma mater, Northeastern Illinois University, we started off in Englewood. We were a teaching school and we still are a teaching college today. That was a big attraction to early Englewood. They wanted to get this college. They wanted to erase any working class image that they originally had. It wasn't about trains. We're about higher learning and middle class living. And it was also, like most places on the South Side, originally very white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. By the 1910s, because the Irish could read and speak English, they got promoted pretty fast in the stockyards. So they can boss around the checks and the polls. So they started flooding to Englewood, which originally did not want them there. By the 1920s, they were the main ethnic group. This was the Irish Gold Coast for the South Side. On 55th Street or Garfield Boulevard, they had some of the biggest churches in the city that were Irish. When they would do holy ceremonies like May crowning, they would shut the street down to traffic. It was that big an event in Englewood. It was also the retail powerhouse of the South Side and also the second biggest in the city. They did not draw the big department stores. They didn't have a branch of Carson Peary Scott or Marshall Fields, but they had Weebolts and they had Sears. And being the number 2 in the city meant they were better than every city in Illinois. So better than Evanston, better than Springfield. Movies may have played well in Peoria, but did not pay well to shop in Peoria because Englewood made so much money. Through the 1930s and 40s during the Great Depression, they held fast. They had people shopping there. Anything you wanted would have been in Englewood. They had movie palaces, bakeries, shoe stores. Everything you would want, they had. 1950s was a different story. There is a book called Old Chicago Houses that talks about Englewood. You can find it in your library. It's pretty depressing because all these houses are now gone. But they talk about how Englewood is thriving. They also describe it as old because a lot of the housing in Englewood was from the 1870s, 1880s. There are some newer ones too, but you had a lot of Victorians. The people who were living in Englewood in the 1950s weren't as affluent as the people who were living there in the 1920s or especially in the 1890s. Money was moving further southwest. As the Irish became even more affluent, they didn't want to live in Englewood. That's where your grandparents lived. They were moving to curvy streets like in Beverly. If you were a little bit tighter on budget, you lived in Mount Greenwood, West Elton, these nice, tidy 1950s homes. The age in Englewood was starting going up. There were still young families there, but they were more middle class. And we also got, in the 1950s, the shopping mall. Evergreen Plaza was built in Evergreen, Illinois. And people realized, well, if I'm living in Mount Greenwood or Beverly, I can just shop here. It's so much closer and it's air conditioned. So in the 1970s, they noticed we're losing a lot of money in this district. We need to change it. So we need to make a mall here too. And then we got the Englewood Concourse. This was a very band-aid approach. A lot of Midwestern cities did this too. If your retail was suffering, make it a pedestrian mall. Englewood took it kind of to the extra level because they shut off 63rd and Halsted. And all around the perimeter, blocks were knocked down to create parking lots. They thought this would encourage people to come here, It did the opposite. So you kicked a lot of people who lost their homes, so they had to leave the area. And these big department stores were losing to suburban malls. They were cleaner, and then you had Sears close, and you had Weebolt's close, and it just kept getting worse and worse each decade as it went along. White people who were living in Englewood, which were the majority, started to realize this neighborhood's beginning to die. Maybe I should follow my friends and family and move to Beverly. So you had this exodus of middle-class white people. There were some that remained. Englewood for a while was integrated. And in reality, Englewood for entire history has almost been integrated. When people say Englewood turned black at one time, that's not actually the case. If you're weird like me, like looking at old yearbooks, if you look at yearbooks from like 1910, there are black kids at Englewood High School. The way redlining worked, if they didn't want African Americans in your neighborhood, you can make this rule, like you can't cross this line. But if there's vacant land and the owner of the land doesn't care who buys it because money's green, it don't matter who buys here, you can build black housings there. So there were portions of Englewood that always had black people. And as the white people were leaving in the 50s and the 60s, middle-class blacks started moving in because they're like, this is my chance of getting the American dream. Like, these houses are a little bit older, but there's nothing wrong with them. But they were investing in a dying neighborhood. When the big department stores started to shutter, people who would still shop in the area from different neighborhoods were like, I'm not going to come just for a mom and pop. Then the mom and pop started closing. And then you have these neighborhoods that were once was very vibrant, empty storefronts, and no one would want to rent in them. There were the single-family homes. You would get a bunch of foreclosures. So now this very brief middle-class black neighborhood started to decline pretty rapidly. And then you ended up having crime coming up. You couldn't open a store in Englewood. You couldn't get credit to open a store in Englewood. In the 1990s, Englewood Concourse was demolished in hopes of bringing back some of this retail. It never happened. We did get a branch of a community college built in the area. There's also a shopping center that recently had a Whole Foods, and it currently has a Starbucks, I believe, but it's nowhere near as retail heavy as it used to be in the past. And people can't afford to live in Englewood anymore. You have to leave the neighborhood to get a job. You can't be like in the 1920s or 1950s where, well, I just want to be a middle-class person, let me go work at Sears. You can't find these jobs anymore. And Englewood continues to actually disappear because Norfolk Southern has odd their eyes on parts of Englewood. There's a part that they wanted to buy in use of eminent domain, and they promised it would be this boom for the neighborhood, but people in the neighborhood weren't having it. They wanted concrete promises. You can't just say it'll be a boom, but how would it be a boom? What are you going to give us? So they want a large percentage of the people to work these yards that they want to create in Norfolk Southern, the largest in Chicagoland, to be people from the neighborhood. You're literally evicting people. Either they're happy to sell to you, but there are a lot of people who didn't want to sell. Their grandparents bought this home in the 1960s. This is like their legacy, and you're trying to take it away. And there's actually a really good documentary called The Area. You can find it, I think, on YouTube. You can look it up. But it's a really good documentary, and it focuses on this area that Norfolk Southern was buying. And you can see on the map, this neighborhood is no longer, there's maybe one or two houses left. And there's all these grand plans, but right now it's a very slow process. And even the alderman said that this train company is not benefiting the black community. They're just building off the back of slaves. So we have this legacy of, in Chicago, where if you're the right shade or the right economic class, your neighbor could be spared. But if you're not, you're at the mercy of whoever wants to buy you. Even if you don't want to sell, you can still lose your house. So it is a sad story, and they're still continuing to build this yard, but they promise it's going to be a boom, but how's that going to help this neighborhood if you're not hiring people from within? Isn't this sad? I'm like, I hate this topic. The next one, we're still on the south side. We're going to be here for, I think, one more time. And this is actually a neighborhood that I remember. So we're going to go to the Chicago Lawn community area. Does anyone know what Chicago Lawn is? Anybody? Southwest. It's by Marquette Park. It's a very pretty park. If you've never been there, it's a really pretty park. Before 1920s, there would have been nothing here but prairie. By the 1920s, this area was peppered in Chicago's apparent favorite housing style, the bungalow. And in the back of the yards, just like the Irish wanted to leave, the Poles and the Lithuanians also wanted to leave too. They did not go south to Englewood. They went to this area in Chicago Lawn that we're going to talk about. And this is Lithuanian Plaza. So if you've been in Chicago long, and if you grew up here, you probably heard Chicago is the largest Polish city outside of Poland. We're also the largest Lithuanian city outside of Lithuania. They started coming here in the 1870s. They got lured by the jobs in the stockyards. If you remember high school, or you still read today as an adult, you remember Lithuanians in a book by Upton Sinclair, The Jungle, that focused on the Lithuanian community. And they thought of Chicago Lawn, this is their Gold Coast. This is away from the soot. This is away from the cow shit. This is clean living. This is the American dream. You have a brick home with stained glass and wood trim. You have this large park in your front yard. And this area was very Eastern European for quite a long time. As the 1950s and 1960s, this is very still Lithuanian and very Pole. But then you started getting suburban flight too. As most ethnic groups, I think almost every ethnic group in the city have always wanted to leave Chicago secretly. The Germans followed Lincoln Avenue, the Poles followed Milwaukee, the Italians followed Grand, and the Lithuanians were started to flock to places like Woodridge and Lamont and Darien. And this neighborhood started to lose a little bit of its Lithuanianness. I remember it being in Lithuanian Plaza in Marquette Park in the 1990s, and a bunch of little blonde, blue-eyed children running around during summer camp. And I'm like, what language are they? They sound like goblins. They're not speaking Polish. They were speaking Lithuanian. I've heard Polish before, but never. And I'm like, oh. So in the 1990s, this neighborhood got an influx of Lithuanians. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, they got lured to this neighborhood that's historically Lithuanian. And like, oh, we could settle down here. But it was really short-lived. They realized when they came here too, this neighborhood's a little bit older. It's really not that much Lithuanian anymore. In the 1970s, they covered the area between 69th from Western and California was dubbed Lithuanian Plaza Court because it was a mixed area of like residential and commercial. You found Lithuanian bakeries and social clubs and bars. But that was about the extent of it. This neighborhood was going through slow ethnic change, and just like the predecessors, they wanted the suburbs too. So these transplants from the former USSR did not stay very long. As many old school Chicagoans will know, maybe some of them in the room today, if you're an ethnic Chicagoan, you will always romanticize the old neighborhood. And this is how Lithuanian Plaza became. When people started moving to the suburbs, you lived in Lamont, you went to school in Lamont, but you still remember that good Lithuanian bakery on 69th Street. So you would come there just for that. Or there was a social organization that you would go monthly. Or you wanted a drink at the local bar. But as the neighborhood continued to change ethnically, these shop owners were like, well, all our clients are in Lamont now. Maybe we should move there too. By the 1990s, it's just a ghost neighborhood. The signs on the streets still say Lithuanian Plaza. There is nothing Lithuanian left. The only thing left, there is one Lithuanian church, and that is Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the very pretty church. But besides that, the Lithuanian community has long left Chicagoland. We can think of it as sad, but we can also think of they got their slice of the American dream. But now this neighborhood is still around. It's just half Mexican, half African American, and the plaza itself has almost no business left on it. So if you can still see it, it's kind of sad, but if you ever find yourself in Chicagoland, you can get a brief taste and a brief view of what a very vibrant Lithuanian community looked like. So we're leaving the south side finally. And we're going to the west side, which I generally call the best side. And I am not being tongue-in-cheek about that, because I'm very tongue-in-cheek. And the reason I say the west side is the best side is the over-dramatization, but the north side has been generally middle class and upper middle class for almost all existence. The south side had a lot of money and also had the black belt. But on the west side, you had the whole American goulash. You had every ethnic group. You had the Poles, Jewish people, Italians, Greeks. We even had French people on the west side. They were living, who started off in tenements. They worked hard and then ended up getting greystones and bungalows. And I think that really is the American dream. How many people knew how to say the entry word today? So this is a very interesting neighborhood, and it made me bring out my very fun shoewear because we're talking about the Dutch West Side. And when we think of the Dutch in Chicago, a lot of people automatically think Roseland or South Holland, the suburb. But there was also a Dutch community on the west side too. They started off in the 1870s closer to the Chicago River. Pardon me. I live so close to Wisconsin, I have to drink brandy. I think it's a law. So they started off on the west side, closer to the river. The Dutch always wanted to go west. That was their motto, westward, westward. And for an ethnic group in Chicago, they had a pretty good foundation. The Netherlands was very educated, and educated for both boys and girls. They even noted in the schools in the area, the public schools, how the number of Dutch girls. They wanted their children educated. They wanted them to do better. So by the 1870s, after leaving the parts by the river, which were basically shanties, 1880s rolled in, they come into Groninger Hoek. Groninger Hoek means Groninger Quarter. It's like the French Quarter. They're from a certain area of the Netherlands. And they came to this area because this section of Chicago was closer to the edge of the city. It was cleaner, the housing stock was better. You even had some brick houses, you had some high-class living. And they had enough room to create their churches. Church was very important for the Dutch people. They were mostly Protestant. They had a high tolerance of different religions as long as you were Dutch. So it's actually a byproduct of how bad the Spaniards were. In case you didn't know European history, Spain owned the Netherlands for about 100 years. The Spaniards were actually repressed a long time by the Moors, who would boil them alive in olive oil if they didn't want to convert. So you'd think the Spaniards would be a little bit nicer when it came to other religions. They weren't. When they got in charge of the Netherlands, they came to this country and they realized the Dutch were dabbing, and we're not talking about Sticky Icky or the Purple Stank. They were dabbing in Protestantism. And as much as the Spaniards disliked or wanted to convert Jewish people to Catholicism, they would not tolerate Protestantism. This was within 100 years. You saw about 60,000 Dutch people killed. You saw whole Dutch cities burned. I mean, their shoes were made out of wood. They was like they were walking Kindle. So when the Dutch were able to overthrow the Spaniards, what did we do about Catholicism? Because about 40% of the Netherlands was still Catholic. Well, the king was very pragmatic, so he didn't want to make the decision by himself. So he called in the noblemen and governors and high-ranking officials and mayors and even very wealthy merchants, because they played a part. And they had to decide, what are we going to do about Catholicism? And everyone was like, we need to outlaw it out of principle. Okay, we're going to outlaw Catholicism. So for 1 year, Catholicism was illegal in the Netherlands. Within that 1 year, a lot of people were getting arrested for being Catholic. You had regular people, artisans, you had wealthy merchants, governors, princes. A lot of the same people who voted to allow outlaw Catholicism. We're secretly Catholic. And then, well, we need to reanalyze this. So then the king is like, well, on second thought, if the Catholics can be cool, then you can live in Netherlands and we won't bother you. And they were. So they carried this tolerance to the New World. So if you were in Groninger Hoek, which is off Ashland and 14th, 15th, Hastings Street, noted on Hastings Street, you can find a Dutch Jew, a Dutch Catholic, and a Dutch Protestant all living next to each other and happy as clams. This did not happen with like any other ethnic group in Chicago. Even Catholics, you couldn't mix them. You had to have a Polish church and an Irish church and an Italian church. You could never mix them. But the Dutch were very tolerant. And they were also very tidy. The newspaper talked about how tidy they were. And their little brick homes, that they were very tidy. And this is funny because a lot of them were like junk man removal people, like as their career. But as time progressed, their kids were educated in the American school system. They would make more money than their parents did. They decided to move, you guessed it, west. And they became enamored with a very Chicago housing style in North Lawndale. The little castles we have in the city, Greystones. They started coming to the Lawndale neighborhood around 1910. They still went back to the old neighborhood for church, but the more affluent were moving west. By the 1930s and 1940s, it was a different story, as almost every ethnic group has done in the past. They broke outside the city barrier. They went to North Berwyn and North Cicero. It's not just for Czech people. Anyone could barely live in Berwyn and Cicero. By the 1950s, the old churches in Groninger Hoek, particularly the one on Ashland Boulevard, it was sold. It was sold to a black congregation, St. Stevenson. This neighborhood became middle-class black. And it was too far for the everyday person to go on Sundays. So they built a new church in Cicero. But the Dutch, you just can't keep them still because he kept moving. By the 1950s, they started coming to Maywood and to Bellwood because the lots were bigger. This was more suburban. And by the 50s and 60s, they kept moving. And today we find the original settlers of Groninger Hoek, they're living in DuPage County. I guess somebody wants to live there, not me. But they're living in Westmont. The original church that started off on Ashland Boulevard, it moved many times. It is in Westmont now. Today on the west side we have no Dutch left. Their main church was knocked down, I think like 3 years ago. It was decaying for a very long time. And even the neighborhood, Groninger Hoek, it was demolished. Thanks to eminent domain, because the medical district had grand plans for this area. These grand plans haven't produced anything in about 20 years. So if you're ever going to Pilsen and you look north, like, why are all these empty streets and sidewalks? That's where Groninger Hoek was. So that really is a lost neighborhood. But it is kind of happy the church that they started is still flourishing in the western suburbs. And I got to wear my wooden shoes. And talking about wooden shoes, I always like to give some pointless trivia that has nothing to do with anything. Does anyone know why people wear wooden shoes? So, I will tell you. So, this story is not bullshit, but it has to do with bullshit. So, they're not only known in the Netherlands, also in much of Northern Europe. If you were in a city, you wouldn't wear wooden shoes unless you were really, really poor. You wore leather shoes. If you were in the country, you wore wood shoes if you worked on a farm because poop will disintegrate leather. The pH will dissolve it. But wooden shoes, it doesn't do it. And even if it does, you can just carve out a new one. So this is why the Dutch are known for the wooden shoes. But in reality, a city person would never wear them. For our next neighborhood, we're still on the west side. We're in the Tri-Taylor neighborhood. And this one's a small neighborhood. It's a very fun one. This is Campbell Park. So if you as an audience, if you're an amateur historian, certain things in a neighborhood usually mean something. So like if your neighborhood, there's a weird street that curves a certain way, there's probably a reason why it curves. Or if you're Like there's something that looks like a school in my neighborhood. It's an apartment now. You should probably look it up. It probably was a school or some kind of institution. Or if you're in a neighborhood from 1950s and there's like 3 or 4 bungalows, you're probably living in a failed subdivision. So Campbell Park, it's long gone, but this footprint is still there. Like much of the neighborhoods on the west side, the land value was pretty high, so you couldn't build these grand parks that you would build on the out parts of the city. So it was basically 2 blocks, and you had a central parkway that was crowned with a fountain. This was very, very Victorian. Aldine Square also loved a good fountain too. So they built this area as an exclusive enclave because it was so close to the medical district. Of course, doctors wanted to live here. Today, the markings are still there, but this neighborhood fell to the wrecking ball because of eminent domain and urban renewal, and it really shouldn't have. By the 1950s, this was a very there's always Anglo-Saxon Protestants, they're always involved. So it was a very Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Eventually the Italians moved in. This was a very nice section to live because it was off of Taylor. And when urban renewal came through the medical district, which was fueled by Mayor Daley, the old G Mayor Daley, people touted like, this is great, we're getting rid of these old dilapidated neighborhoods. But they really weren't. They were ethnic neighborhoods that were either Italian or Greek or Jewish. These people lived in this neighborhood. They took a lot of interest in their neighborhood, even as much as planting trees on the median way out of their own pocket. But eventually did meet the wrecking ball by the 1980s. So many people touted like, this is great. We have all these new labs and for UIC. But the Italian American community disagrees. Mayor Daley was not known to like the Italian American community. He was all too eager to knock this down, and it exemplifies how certain ethnic whites have a higher place on the totem pole as opposed to Greeks, Italians, and Jews, that we can have our neighborhoods demolished. So if you want to go to Campbell Park today, the footprint is still exactly there. Even the part where it curves where the fountain was, I only found this on a weird rabbit hole. Like, why is this here? So this is how my interest in this neighborhood got about. So if you're interested in your own neighborhood too, I strongly suggest you look at weird oddities in your neighborhood, because you may be living in a former village, you may be living on the grounds of a burial site or Potawatomi village. It could be a whole plethora in Chicago. Continuing with the west side, we're going to talk about Fifth City. Does anyone know where Fifth City is? Anyone? Oh, good. Okay, we had one. So this is the Garfield Park area, and it's named Fifth City because there is a diagonal street called Fifth Avenue. And it's spelled out, and it's not a numbered street because it was renamed because Fifth Avenue in New York City is a very posh street. It's a lot more elegant than Colorado Avenue. So when this neighborhood that was built, this was pretty much prairie. This is when Sanborn maps and Robinson maps come into use. I strongly recommend, if you have any interest in Chicago history, utilize them because they're a lot of fun too. But in Chicago, you can see like all these grids and like, oh, we had all these streets. In Garfield Park in the 1870s, you had intersection of nothing. It would have been mud and prairie. And in this stark wilderness, one of my favorite Chicagoans decided to build a subdivision and lure people out there. And if you've been to my lectures before, you're like thinking, this is where he talks about Marshall motherfucking Field. And I am not, because I am not a one-trick pony. We are talking about S.E. Gross.
Yes!
S.E. Gross, if you did not know who he was a developer. In his career, he built 21 communities in Chicago and over 10,000 homes. He was a very typical Victorian man. He married a woman half his age because, as the expression goes, just because there is snow on the roof doesn't mean there's no fire in the furnace, if you know what I mean. And what made him so interesting for a Victorian man, he was nice. A lot of Victorian men who became wealthy got by stepping over someone, and he wasn't. So he generally worked with lower class residents who wanted workers' cottages. If you lost your job, which is very common during Victorian Chicago, he wouldn't evict you. He hardly evicted anyone. It was bad business. So if you lost your job, okay, let's talk business. Is someone working in your house? Can you pay this? Can you just pay the interest? He didn't want to do that because he knew if he created a loyal base, once they found a job again, which they would stay loyal to him. There were many people who started off living in a wood shack that was built by Gross and ended in retirement living in a brick home. They rose up the ladder. One of my favorite, because he was also very, very cheap by working with lower class people or lower income people. So if you knew who he was, because he was a big developer, like every big developer knew S.E. Gross. And outside of the city limits, if you ever driven to Riverside, Illinois, curvy streets, it looks like a park because it was made by someone who developed parks. Olmsted. So, not to be outdone, S.E. Gross created a town right next to it called Grossdale. Riverside was dubbed the Queen Suburb. He dubbed Grossdale himself the new Queen Suburb because he was that petty. So one day, this is all paraphrased, he called Frederick Law Olmsted in his office. They knew each other. So his secretary was like, Mr. Olmsted, I have Mr. Gross on the line for you. Oh, Sam, put him through. So they start doing small talk, and then S.E. Gross starts asking questions about lot sizes and street grades and curbs and lots, all these things that are very specific. And then Olmsted's like, Mr. Gross, this is a consultation call. Tell you what, let me pass back to my secretary. She'll go over my fees and my schedule with you. And S.E. Gross is like, consultation? I thought this is a friendly chat. And he hung up the phone. He was totally trying to get free information. He was used to working with shacks, not nicer homes. You may know one of his nicer homes is district right behind us, the street of 40 doors, Alta Vista Terrace. That was what he designed. But 30 years beforehand, he dipped his toes into upper middle class development on the west side in Garfield Park on 5th and Monroe. And this was quite a stretch because this was far from the city center, and the people he wanted to lure were urbane, upper middle class Chicagoans. Just like if you go out to the fringe counties of Chicagoland where they build these expensive subdivisions, the neighbors are podunk, like in McHenry County. Like half the county can't read, I don't think. I can say that because I live out there now. But he had to lure people to live there and also to shop there because there was no shopping. So when he built this area, it was row houses, and he thought of everything because people need to shop. I will build stores for them. And he marketed this area as fresh air, clean water, and on the booming west side. It was not booming yet, but give it 20 years and it would be very dense. Madison Street would be a very major thoroughfare. Fifth Avenue would be not as big, but it would be all retail on the first floors. And he drew this middle class people that he wanted. By the 1950s, this neighborhood was more diverse. You had people leaving the tenements, rising up the social ladder. You found Jewish people, Catholics, Protestants. You could throw a stone and hit some religious building in Garfield Park. And it did really well too, because even if you weren't solidly middle class, the west side was peppered with factories. And these were the stepping stones for a lot of these Eastern Europeans and Central Europeans to become middle class. They weren't fun jobs. They weren't clean jobs, but they paid the bills, and you can buy that gravestone. By the 1950s and 60s, though, we started having white flight. A lot of people came back with the GI Bill. This neighborhood got very dense because they weren't building new houses. The west side's historically been very dense. People started moving to western suburbs, like newer ones like Bellwood and Maywood. And black people that were encroaching this area, like, okay, now we can invest in this neighborhood. This is a very middle-class neighborhood. But the stepping stone that these factories offered were slowly leaving too. Because if you've ever seen a Victorian factory or a 1910, 1920s factory, they're brick and tall. By the 1950s, factories started to get long and 1 or 2 stories. You really don't have the room on the west side for that anymore. So you can just build one in Bellwood. It works great because half your staff lives there now too. So with the stepping stone went away, this neighborhood started becoming more blighted. You started seeing diminished public transportation. So even if you did have a job in the Loop, it's kind of hard to get there now. And this neighborhood got plagued by poverty, by gang violence, by disinvestment. And today, if you look at Fifth City, it's mostly pockmarked. There is some development in, I think, 2005, Redfin deemed Garfield Park the hot new neighborhood. That has not happened in Garfield Park. But they still have a strong sense of community in Garfield Park. There is big efforts to try to revitalize the area, but they also want to revitalize when not causing gentrification. As gentrification moves west, and if you've been a Chicagoan long enough, like I have, where neighborhoods 30 years ago you did not want to live in, now they're the hottest neighborhoods in the city, it's moving that way, and we don't want Garfield Park to evict all its residents because they can't live there, because they're willing to want to live there and invest in there. So today it's an interesting neighborhood. It's on the decline. It's also rebounding. It has a very interesting conservatory. And it just shows what happens when you take the stepping stones of secure jobs away from people. You could take it away from any color of people. And if you take that away, the neighbor is going to falter. And now, as we were leaving the west side, we're going to the northwest side. And this neighborhood is a bit of a lie. We're going to talk about the lost village of Pennock, Illinois, and I saved this one for last because it's actually not gone. It was forgotten for a long time. Like, let me do a sprinkle of sunshine sometime in this lecture. So the village of Pennock was located in Logan Square, and this was built in Logan Square before the city owned it. This was rural country. It was founded in 1881 by Homer Pennock. If you go down Wrightwood today, past Hamlin, you'll notice the parkway, that grassy area between the street, it gets wider. This is because Pennock wanted this main thoroughfare as Pennock Boulevard. So of course you're going to have this wide grassy area. And this village started off as most villages in Chicagoland. This was industrial. And it was also supplemented by Pennock owning a mine in Colorado, because Victorian men always dealt with mines for some reason. It was a side hustle. Like today we deliver Grubhub, like Victorian men had like gold mines in Colorado. They also had a manufacturing company called Osgood Manufacturing Company. They made refrigerators and furniture. And the problem with this, they were the main employer of this town of roughly 800 people. There were also some shops too to deal with like groceries and things you would need along those lines. But this one factory was supporting the old town. And then the factory caught on fire. And then they didn't rebuild. And then poor Pennock, his gold mine got flooded. So he does not have his side hustle anymore. So Pennock is like, peace out, I'm leaving. So he abandons this town he founded. And people are like, well, how do we support our house? So Pennock designed employee housing. And they were actually really, maybe even too good. Not that working class people shouldn't have nice houses, but these were like larger single family homes that if you lived in an industrial town like Pullman, you would have been like a foreman to live in something like this. So when people don't have a job anymore, and the stores in town are closing because people are taking out credit and not be able to pay them back, it became a ghost town. People just left. And the city eventually annexed this area in the 1890s. And as Chicago grew and neighborhoods grew closer to this, like there's this oddity. There's like this ghost town on the prairie. And little kids, because they're punks, they would throw rocks through the window because nobody lives. But luckily, these houses are actually still around today. If you go down Wrightwood or many side streets too. There's actually some pictures in the slides. They're still there. For a long time, people forgot about this village because it was talked about in the Chicago newspaper in the 1920s. But these houses are still around, and since they're in Logan Square, they're probably going to cost you a pretty penny too. But I wanted to end with a happy note because I'm like, man, what a depressing lecture. Like look at all these great buildings that are gone now. So, in closing, I hope I inspired you guys as budding historians to take a closer look in your neighborhood. I provided some links at the end of my presentation of sources that I use when I give my lectures, when I'm just bored at 2 in the morning and I want to look at old maps. Because each neighborhood has history. Even if you don't think it does, it has some kind of history. You can look up the history of your house. Why is so-and-so's name on your mortgage? Whose addition to Chicago are you? Are you living on a Potawatomi village? Are you on a burial site? Were you living in a former industrial site? Were you living in a former posh neighborhood? There's so much neighborhood history. This is why us as Chicagoans, Chicagoans, we really don't give them any tours downtown. Downtown's fine, but we're a city of neighborhoods. So I think appreciating the neighborhoods, and if you go on one of our tours, learning about neighborhoods, or even if you want to do it yourself, Chicago has so much to offer if you're willing to dig a little bit. And that is the end of my presentation, so thank you. Take any questions if anybody has any questions.
So at Logan Square, I know the neighborhood's gone, but the fountain is still there, right? The pond?
So you asked in Aldine Square is the fountain, that's gone. It was demolished when they built Ida B. Wells.
Oh, and then I must be thinking of another neighborhood that still has a...
You're thinking of Minnehaha Parkway in Ashburn or Auburn.
Auburn.
Yeah.
What's the address of all these?
All-
Prospect.
Oh, it would have been on Vincent and 38th. So it's just an empty grassland today.
Was this neighborhood right here used to be something else?
Everything in Chicago was always something else. So along the lake, he asked if this neighborhood was anything else in the past. Like on the north side, we had, especially along the lakefront, we had a lot of orchards at one time. Because we're so close to the lake, we had cherry orchards here. Edgewater was covered in celery and cabbage. This was, if you see, especially in Lakeview, if you see a lot of 4+1s, like these big blocky buildings that from the 50s and the 60s, they replaced probably a mansion or a larger 3-flat. So like neighborhoods are constantly evolving. As this neighborhood, when people wanted to invest in it and invest in the 1950s, like, why are we just having a 3-flat here when we can have 60 people living in a 4+1? So this neighborhood evolved to, like, this used to be Japanese at one time. This neighborhood used to be incredible, especially this section was very Swedish until the 1930s. But Swedes kept moving further north. They were in Andersonville, and eventually they hit the North Shore. Anybody else? Oh, go ahead, Steph.
So far, all the neighborhoods we talked about were mostly divided by either nationality, other, racial groups. Were there any neighborhoods that were like developed by other, like quote unquote, special interest groups?
So if any neighborhood has been ever developed by any special group, like religious organizations or racial groups or
Like really honestly any other group? I know that at one time there was like a community of little people. Were they like occupying a specific neighborhood? Was there like any other like groups that people were like?
the only thing I could think of, like in Hyde Park and Hyde Park, especially in Woodlawn, they had a large gypsy population at one time. And the South Side was like pocketed with ethnic groups that we don't technically think of in Chicago very much today. Like off of in Chatham, the part by the railroad, that was an ethnic growth subdivision called Dolphin Park, and that had a high Hungarian population. And today we don't think of Hungarians in Chicago at all, but they were at one time in Dolphin Park. Go ahead.
We got another. The Tri-Taylor area, I know you talked about Campbell Park. was that like adjacent to the Taylor Street and the Italians? Because my mom grew up in Taylor Street. I'd never heard her talk about Campbell Park. So I'm just wondering if it's
It would
a
have
couple neighborhoods.
it would have just been just north. You asked about if Taylor Street was associated with Taylor and Campbell Park. It was just north of it,
Okay.
so it would be probably like 3 or 4 blocks north of Campbell Park,
Okay.
where Campbell Park was.
Right, okay.
So like originally it was very white, and then it became more diverse and white Italians as they kept moving on, and the doctors who originally lived in Campbell Park moved further west into Garfield and eventually into Oak Park.
Okay. And I know it was eminent domain that they got rid of a lot of. My grandpa told stories. The government asked you once, the government asked you twice.
The old neighborhood.
You're getting thrown out. They're not paying you.
Okay.
What's your favorite old or demolished neighborhood and why?
Ooh, what is my favorite old demolished neighborhood and why? So this is actually one that I dropped from my lecture because I didn't think I would have enough time. And I was going to talk about the lost neighborhood of Uptown. And very people are like, I live in Uptown, or I go to Uptown all the time. The Uptown we see today, it was either built in the 1920s, the 1950s, or more recently. But Uptown was originally built as an exclusive enclave where people built large mansions, and these were doctors and lawyers and inventors who lived there. If you want to see what old Uptown would have been like when it was all single-family homes, I think we give a really good Buena Park tour, and the tour guide is pretty attractive too. So it was largely like, it's interesting to see how a neighborhood, we think of the 1920s being old, but stuff 1920s buildings in Uptown probably replaced a Victorian mansion that was maybe like 30 years old. It probably didn't even have cobwebs yet because of skyrocketing price values.
All right, I think that's it.
Thanks everybody.
All right, thank you, Anthony. Wow, heavy hitter. Yet presented so well. Thank you everyone for coming out. Fun reminder, the bar stays open, and so does the donation bucket. Feel free to join us in whatever way you can. Thanks for being here.